So Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going. Are we good, Bobby? All right. So y'all have seen this for a while now. So y'all are ready for my first question. What is he talking about? He says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. What does that mean? Don't be idle. Do everything with a passion, with energy. Do everything while you can. And that's in here particularly for sure. He's saying, you've got limited time. Don't waste it. Right? Don't waste your life. So you might be wondering, why are we in Ecclesiastes in a series on spiritual gifts? Well, this isn't where I initially intended to go, but I felt like I was being pushed this direction, so here we are. And so now I want us to go from there to the book of 1 Peter, chapter 4. And now we'll see how that ties into spiritual gifts. 1 Peter chapter 4, and starting in verse 10. And so that reads, as each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. And so, Peter here mentions each one of us has received a special gift. And he says we should employ it as good stewards. And then he describes what that looks like for a couple of different sorts of gifts: speaking, serving, and more or less it sounds like that the speaking and serving kind of encapsulates a lot of the more particular gifts that are involved. You have the gift of teaching, for instance, is mostly speaking. But there's other sorts too. The gift of prophecy is also mostly speaking or writing. Serving, of course, there's many gifts. The gift of helps, the gift of healing, the gift of miracles, all sorts of serving. Also, there's the gift of administration. And so it's kind of broad categories. But in both of these, he says that we should be good stewards of the gift that we're given. And we should take it seriously, basically. Whoever is speaking should speak as one who is speaking the utterances of God. And whoever serves as one who should do so as one who is serving by the strength that God supplies. So to me, this sounds a lot like the passage in Ecclesiastes. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. So when applied to spiritual gifts, how would you connect those concepts? I mean, do you think that that is an applicable description, that you should employ the gifts, the talents that God has given you with all your might? That was an easy yes. There's not a lot of elaboration required there. So, going to a more difficult question, how do you apply the spiritual gifts that you're given with all your might? Just do it. Don't slack up.
That's true, but you also have to consider that the spiritual gifts are gifts of the Holy Spirit, and the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. The prayer and spending time with the Lord is going to be where you search to gain the help that's necessary for you to be able to go at it without slacking up.
That's very true. Just trying to blindly forge forward without spending the time recharging, without spending the time in the Word and prayer and meditation, and really drawing deeper into your relationship with the Lord, you're not going to be effective in using spiritual gifts, because they are from the Spirit and they require us to develop our relationship with God in order to effectively use them. And we have to be careful of not quenching or grieving the Spirit by what we're doing, but always feeding the Spirit's activity in our lives. The Spirit is like a fire. If you throw water on it, it tends to want to go out. If you feed it lots of food, then it gets bigger. And if you just take food away from it and you don't throw water on it, but you don't feed it either, then it will just kind of peter down to embers. And so likewise, the things that we do in our daily lives have an effect on our spiritual walk, our spiritual health. I mean, if there's sin in our lives that we're not dealing with, that we're not seeking God's will that they be removed, then that grieves the Holy Spirit and it quenches His fire. If we do not spend time in the Word and in prayer, then we are quenching the Spirit's flame because we are not feeding it. And so if we are to, do what God has given us to do with all our might, then it requires us not only to be acting outward toward the church, but also focused inward on God in us. So, in 1 Peter 4 here, he says we've all got spiritual gifts that we should be good stewards of. What are the gifts for? The gifts are to serve others. And ultimately to glorify God. Exactly. The gifts are for the church. They are for us to function as a unified body which has diverse parts, as was described in more detail in 1 Corinthians. But ultimately, the church exists to glorify God. And so each part of the church exists to glorify God individually and corporately. And so everything that we do should glorify God. And, as he says it here, so that in all things God is glorified through Jesus Christ. But it's not just that God is glorified as a net result of the whole process, but in all the pieces. So, in all things, God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. So, we've talked to some extent about how you use your spiritual gifts and how you develop them, strengthen them by just spending time in the Word, spending time in prayer, serving, practicing. What keeps us from being more effective in that? What keeps us from being more effective in using the talents that God has given us to glorify Him? Busyness is a big factor. Yes, we have a lot of things to do. We have a lot of responsibilities, and we have some things that maybe shouldn't be responsibilities that we've taken on that are distracting.
Worldly distractions play a huge part in that.
Worldly distractions.
Not just a matter of busyness, but Satan uses the things around us to divert our attention and keep our attention and focus away from God and what He has for us to do through all kinds of lies and deceptions.
That's right. so that the work of the devil is always active, trying to distract us, to drive us away. And so we have to be vigilant. What was that? Not being part of the body. That's a big one. If we do not participate in the church, then how is our gift to help the church? Because the gifts are not individual things. They're not just... None of the spiritual gifts are to be used in isolation. They're all corporate. Anything else? So, we've talked about how to strengthen our use of the spiritual gifts, and we've talked about what keeps us back, and what we should be vigilant about. How do we measure success? How do we know that we are growing in our walk with Christ, in our use of our gifts for His glory? Is there a way to know, or we just have to wait until we get to glory and He tells us? If things are working as they should. Well, I mean, you made a good point, though. It reminds me of the way that it's written in Ephesians chapter 4, after he describes the individual gifts. He says in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14, "As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love." And so, what you're saying, I think, is that if you see this happening, if you see the whole body being fitted together and held together by what every joint supplies, and all the individual parts are working together, then you know. Of course, none of us are perfect, and so none of this will happen perfectly now. And there's a lot of times that there are pieces that we don't see that are happening that are not to be revealed yet. But I do think that for the use of the spiritual gifts, a lot of times you do get very quickly indications that God is working through you, because you see what He's led you to do, bringing Him glory. And so we see that in all things particularly, God has the glory when this works as it should. I mean, He gets the glory anyway in everything. But when He's glorified through what we do, then we know that we're doing what He wants us to do.
I think one of the things that is an indicator is the joy that you receive from serving. If it's what, of course, Satan will try to destroy your thoughts and twist things. But when there's joy and you see people growing, learning, the edification and unification of the body through the Spirit, those things bring joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that, when Christ talks about the joy that was set before Him, that it was about joy, and for joy He endured the cross and all of the things that He did. When we are in fellowship with Him through the power of the Holy Spirit, there is joy in service.
That's critical, that we have joy. And I think you've been reading my notes. So that goes exactly where we're going. Because if you look at what Peter says right after talking about this, if we go on into verses 12 and 13, I mean, look at what he says here. Beloved, do not be surprised at all the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share in the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. And so, we should have joy. We should keep on rejoicing, even though things often do not seem like they're going at all well now. Maybe we do see God being glorified through our actions. Maybe we're going through a rough time and we don't see very much of that. And we just have to keep on slogging through. But we know that we are to be tested. We know he promises that we're going to go through hard times. And he promises that we're going to come out of the hard times and into glory, just as Christ did. So why do you think that he puts these things together? So he talked about using the spiritual gifts and doing so in a way that glorifies God, basically doing them with all your might. When you speak, speak as one who's speaking the utterances of God. When you serve, as one who's serving by the strength that God supplies. And then he immediately goes from that into, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal, as though some strange thing were happening, but rejoice. Do you think those are connected? It sure looks like it, doesn't it? And so if we go back, let's go back a little bit before this as well and look at what he said previously. So if we go back to verse 7, he says, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. And then we have the spiritual gifts passage, and immediately, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal. If we go on down further to verse 14 and continue on, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. And so we see, we can go back even further too to verse 1. He says, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. I think particularly verse 7 is important for kind of tying everything in the chapter together. The end of all things is near. Therefore be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. And keep fervent in your love for one another. And so he says you're going to go through hard times. You're going to go through difficulties. You can't grow stronger if you don't go through hard times. And so in the midst of that, serve with the strength that God supplies. Speak as one who's speaking the utterances of God, that in all things God may be glorified in what we do, in the world around us. And then we can rejoice because we know the end. We've already read the last chapter, so we know where we're going. So that is, to my mind, kind of the net result of the spiritual gifts. We know that they are to glorify God. They are to, for the church to work as a body so that each individual has unique pieces which come together like a puzzle, and it all fills out the big picture together. But it's not an optional thing. It's not something that we can just kind of, oh, that's an interesting bit of theology there. Now, this is important. This is something that should be a critical part of our walk with Christ, that we are functioning as a body together, because the body is the bride of Christ. I mean, it isn't just you and God. He calls us to be able to function together and to be a representation of the kingdom of God with the way that we act toward one another. And so Peter puts a great deal of emphasis on just how important this is, perhaps more than Paul does. I mean, Paul mentions it in 3 different letters that he does, but he doesn't ever quite say it in such stark terms, I don't think. That this is something, you know, y'all are all here on Wednesday nights. Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. But how easy is it for us to go home afterwards and say, well, that was interesting. I'm going to go back to the way I normally do things because I'm used to it. And I mean, you may be thinking still, well, I'm not really sure what my spiritual gift is. And we've talked about, Hal talked about discerning your spiritual gifts last week. And it's not a big puzzle, I don't think. I think going back to Ecclesiastes, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. There are certain things that God has blessed you with the ability to do. Most of us are fairly aware of what we're good at. So let's use it with a passion and fervency, relying on Him for strength and bringing Him glory through it, that we can glorify Him. All right, so even with the technical difficulties, we are finishing early. So, does anybody have any last thoughts before we close? All right, well, y'all have a good evening.